I feel like a bit of a wild card in this session, I have to say. So my name's Scaife. I'm a professor at the University of Manchester. I specialise in big data analytics. I'm one of the UK's 5 AI fellows selected by the Alan Turing Institute. And specifically, I work on translation of big data techniques between different domains. I'm also academic co-director of policy at Manchester at the university, which is the unit within the university that helps researchers get policy impact from their research outputs. I'm going to talk specifically about Earth observation and land surface monitoring. The slides that I'm going to show you include work from a very large number of people, not all of whom are named, but I would particularly like to thank Joe Fennell and Renee Breton from the University of Manchester, Edward Stalackley from the University of Sussex, and Emmanuel Ngonga and Catherine Denby from the University of York, who have all contributed figures directly to the presentation. So these days, we are more observed than we ever have been before. We have a variety of satellites monitoring the Earth on different cadences and different spectral bands and providing a wide variety of data. A lot of that data is provided freely on the internet. It's public access, it's extremely useful, and it can be used for a very wide variety of things. So some of these include monitoring environmental changes, urban sprawl, disaster management, monitoring the weather through meteorology, and of course agriculture. And specifically, I'm going to talk about agriculture today, partly through reasons of time and partly because that's where I've been most involved in the analysis of Earth observation data. The work that I'm going to talk about, I'm going to highlight a few examples of projects that are being done at the moment or have recently been concluded, and then I'm going to talk about their relevance to the UK. So these projects are collaborative projects. So these are some of the organisations, the universities and the projects that are working together. None of the 3 projects that I will talk about have been done by a single institution or a single person, and I think that this is a salutary lesson for Earth observation, which is that collaboration is very important here. And there's a great African proverb that says that if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. And I think that is the moral of these projects. These projects are funded largely through the Newton Fund and the Global Challenges Research Fund. So these are global projects, and so I will speak from a global perspective with UK bias. As most projects under ODA funding these projects address the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. For anyone who is not aware of the SDGs, which I hope there's no one in the room, there is, of course, a wealth of information about the SDGs online. We have a tendency to think about the Sustainable Development Goals as applying only to developing countries. But again, I would suggest that the Sustainable Development Goals are actually very important for the UK. A lot of them address the needs that we have here, as well as other countries around the world. So how do we use satellite data and Earth observation to address the Sustainable Development Goals? Well, again, specifically, I'm going to be talking about agriculture for the moment. The way that we use satellite data has changed as more and more satellites go into orbit, as more data becomes available. We do not just take pictures of the Earth and look at them. So satellites these days always have multiple spectral windows. They provide us with information across a variety of spectral bands, and that allows us to do a wide range of analytics on the surface of the Earth. Mainly not by looking at a single spectral window, so what I'm showing you here is just an electromagnetic spectrum, and then these are the different bands for different instruments, in particular the Sentinel-2 satellite spreading over here, and the Landsat-8 satellite spreading over here, which are 2 widely used satellites. So these bands tell us different things. Different combinations of bands can be used to extract plant cover, water, drought, urbanicity, all kinds of different metrics that we can take out of the images through analysis of these bands. They also have different resolutions on the Earth, but the resolutions are pretty good these days. Sentinel-2 is going down to 10 meters on the ground at the moment, which is a resolution that you can do very, very useful work with, but I will also talk about the limitations of that towards the end of the talk. So how do we do this? A very simple example for anyone who's not familiar with the analysis of satellite data. So this is 2 images from the Sentinel-2 satellite. They're both grayscale. I haven't false coloured them up for you, but this is in the red band of the optical, and this is the near infrared, which is slightly longer wavelengths. And what they're showing you is essentially reflectance or emission on the ground. Now that's particularly important when it comes to plant life, because plant life both emits and absorbs in these bands, and it does that differently depending on the photosynthetic capacity of the plant life itself. Basically, healthier plants will have a greater capacity for photosynthesis. So by combining these bands, we can get a measure of that capacity and create a map that looks like this. And this is basically telling you where there is healthy plant cover. So red, there's nothing over here, and then we have arable land over here. The darker the green, the higher the density, the higher the photosynthetic capacity of the plant life. So that's giving us a direct measure of plants on the ground. So how do we use this? So I'm going to start by highlighting an example for soybean production. So this is soybean farming, particularly in Zambia, this example. And what you're seeing here in the background, this is a map that's been made in the same way as I just illustrated by comparing different bands. This is a slightly enhanced form of detecting vegetation. It's called the Enhanced Vegetation Index, which is a different combination of Sentinel-2 bands. And the red areas are where there's lots of photosynthesis. And specifically here, these circular regions are fields within this area. And in this analysis, the student who's doing this, Emmanuel at the University of York, has used that index, that Enhanced Vegetation Index, to automatically classify the different types of land use within the images. And so he's extracted urban areas, forests, arable land, pasture land. He's then used those classifications to extract particularly the soybean fields from his images. So he's using a geo-clipping algorithm to take out the circles, which you can see here, which are each of the soybean fields. It's quite interesting that they're circular rather than think of the traditional British field being square. So this is a form of AI applied to satellite data to specifically extract fields and get that vegetation index. Now the reason for doing that is not just to find fields, or find fields, but to actually monitor what's going on in the fields. So particularly in Zambia, there is an interest in growing soy. So soy is a global crop. It's very bountiful, it's extremely nutritious. But the soybean phenotypes that have been transplanted into Zambia are not doing as well as they are in other regions of the world. So the yield is much lower than they would expect. And so CABI, which is an organisation that works on international biodiversity and agriculture, wanted to do some phenotyping of soybean varieties to determine which one would be most ideal for Zambia. And so what Emmanuel has been doing is been tracking the vegetation index of different soybean phenotypes in Zambia to look at the maximum yield and also the maturity period for those different types. So this is basically the average vegetation index as a function of time for one field. So you can see it's peaking as the crop reaches maturity and then dropping off. And through this work, which is all done automatically through satellite data, he's analysing different phenotypes of soybean varieties and establishing which ones are best for Zambia. So not only which ones will produce the highest yield, but which ones will produce the highest yield fastest. So this kind of analysis, although I've motivated it for Zambia, is of course applicable anywhere. You can do this with a wide variety of crops that are in almost everywhere in the world. So specifically for the UK, is this kind of analysis being done? The answer is yes, but in a limited sense. So in a recent report from the Satellite Applications Catapult within the UK, looking at the impact of Earth observation on farming in the UK, in fact, the thing that was highlighted most was not this use of Earth observation data for monitoring crop yields, but actually just GNSS data. So this is positioning data, same thing tells you where your phone is. So although in general positioning data is beneficial for farming, so the report says that the UK can benefit from £2 per hectare on a 500 hectare farm, or £19 per hectare for a 750 hectare farm. So this is through location-enabled tractors, location-enabled pesticide dispersal, fertilizer dispersal. The reality is that although this was seen as a strength for the UK, the reality is that it's actually not going to work too effectively because the number of farms in the UK that have 500 hectares is very, very small. In fact, the average size of a farm, well, within England from the recent DEFRA report, is only about 80 hectares. And even if you take out the long tail of small holdings, you're going to get up to about 150 hectares. So these advantages that are seen in regions of the world that have larger intensive farming across larger areas are not really applicable to the UK. The advantages that come from Earth observation, looking at crop yields, that kind of thing, they are seen as an opportunity for the UK by this report, but not yet a realised benefit. There are limitations to these methods. Specifically, imaging in the red and near-infrared bands in the UK is hindered significantly by cloud cover. But there are other forms of monitoring, including synthetic aperture radar from the Sentinel-1 satellites and other satellites like that. So these have a potential for application in the UK for policy-relevant areas such as food security, but also for things like carbon sink monitoring in order to achieve climate change goals. Those are both important potential applications. But one of the weaknesses that was highlighted in this report is that the industry currently lacks the analytical expertise to really make an impact in the UK in this area. All of the software that you see for these kinds of applications in a commercial sense is written in the US. But I'd like to quickly talk about Earth observation using more local tools, and specifically unmanned aerial vehicles or drones. So this is an example. You'll have to excuse me for talking over the figures. This is an example from the Parthenium Pakistan project, using drones to track a very invasive weed species called Parthenium. Parthenium's widely spread across the world. It causes a 90% crop yield drop. It's also highly toxic to livestock and poisonous to humans, so it's really nasty stuff. One of the problems with monitoring it is getting the ground truth data that Robert mentioned right at the beginning of this session. So in fact, the Parthenium project has a very large amount of ground truth data from people on the ground. They have 4,000 fields across Pakistan to monitor. But in fact, what they're doing is using drones to actually gather that ground truth data rather than people. And the reason for doing this is to train the machine learning models that can then use the satellite data to do it on a larger scale. Now the reasons for using drones are, firstly, you get actual images of the fields. Second reason is that most farmers do not want 100 ground truthing volunteers tramping through their crop fields. And so actually using a drone, you can hover over the field without any damage to the crops and still provide very accurate data. It's also quite a nice application for citizen science, because these data, of course, can be uploaded to suites such as the Zooniverse. This work specifically is being done with a camera that's being flown on a drone built with a Raspberry Pi board. It mimics the Sentinel-2 bands, so it gives you exactly the same information, but it's much, much cheaper. It is completely open source as well, because it's an academic project, so anyone can do this. Now, in the UK, we don't have Parthenium, but what we do have is blackgrass. And blackgrass is similarly invasive, particularly in wheat fields, which is one of the major UK crops. And the same approach has been tried in the UK for blackgrass. The paper only came out this year. It is mixed, it has to be said. Now, one of the reasons for this is actually the translation from the test fields to other fields. So what works well in one area does not necessarily work well in another. And so that's confused because of the different growth stages of blackgrass, and also because of local environmental conditions. And so you require ancillary data sources in order to augment the models for this kind of analysis. So just finally, I'd like to talk about how you can use these kinds of additional data sources and use them not only to monitor, but also to predict. So particularly for blackgrass, you want to predict the spread of blackgrass in order to more accurately distribute pesticides. So one area where this is being applied at the moment is in the forecasting of agricultural drought. So agricultural drought is not the same as meteorological drought. It's one of the impacts of long-term meteorological drought. And it's one area where early warning systems are much more effective than just post-disaster relief. So monitoring agricultural drought is something that's again being done with satellite data. And this is a monitoring program that's being done at the University of Sussex through the AstroCast scheme. And they are using Gaussian process modelling to forecast droughts up to, I think, 4 weeks in advance. Which is great, but actually what they're moving on to is creating a fully Bayesian model that incorporates a whole bunch of other satellite-derived measures, including rainfall estimates and land surface temperature monitoring to give a better soil moisture measure. Now, anyone who works with synthetic aperture radar might be thinking, gee, synthetic aperture radar. But in fact, synthetic aperture radar these days, modern SAR systems tend to work in bands that are highly affected by both the roughness of the soil and also by plant cover. So historically, we did this at lower frequencies, it was much more effective. The other concern from soil moisture studies in SAR is the penetration depth. So they'll typically only give you a good soil moisture measurement within 10 centimetres of the surface. And so if you're looking at groundwater levels, it's not always sufficient to just use SAR. The other problem with SAR, of course, is that the data is provided a very long time after. So this is relevant for the UK, of course, because these are exactly the same measures that you would use to predict flooding. So I'll finish on this note. So the UK is leading a range of Earth observation analysis. It's doing it on a global scale already, but the results are relevant to the UK. And certainly the projects that are being done under ODA funding, I think in some senses are actually more relevant to the UK, or are highly relevant to the UK for the reasons of scale. So UK farming is on a scale that is more consistent with developing countries than it is with, for example, North America. The size of UK farms is more consistent with the farm sizes in developing countries. The monitoring techniques that need to be used are the same. And so, in fact, I think that there's great potential to use a lot of the work that's been funded in the UK through the ODA programs to actually bring benefit to the UK, especially in terms of sustainable agriculture. However, we still need to work on building this ecosystem that supports that kind of research. And that is not just building that big data analytic expertise. So speaking as someone who works in that area, it is my experience that being a good machine learning specialist is absolutely no good if you don't have domain-specific expertise. So this does not mean contracting out 100 computer scientists. It means building that domain-specific expertise in Earth observation. Communication of data like this is always difficult, especially to the public and to policy stakeholders. And so there's also a lot of work to be done there. But ultimately, all of this analysis depends on availability of data. So I would also leave that as my final message, which is that data